I first began researching the strange urban transformations of the mid-1800s, I expected nothing unusual. Just the standard explanations every textbook repeats: industrial expansion, messy city planning, poor drainage, and the usual narratives historians use to explain the chaos of growing cities. But within the first week of digging through old engineering reports, city maps, and early photographs, something felt off. Not slightly off, completely out of place. Because between 1840 and 1880, across dozens of cities on multiple continents, the same impossible pattern shows up again and again. Entire neighborhoods suddenly appear half buried in dense, compacted earth. Not worn down, not flooded, not eroded over centuries. Buried, abruptly, uniformly. In a way no natural flood has ever behaved. The official explanations appear logical at first. Cities raise their streets. Drainage issues cause soil buildup. Sanitation reforms required new ground levels. But when you line up the data from Paris, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Chicago, Vienna, Boston, Turin, San Francisco, a problem appears. All of these cities supposedly raised their streets at almost the exact same time, 1840 to 1880, and all absorbed nearly identical depths of earth. 2 meters here, 3 meters there, sometimes more. Independent cities, different climates, different technology levels, yet the same outcome. That was the moment I realized this wasn't urban planning. This wasn't coincidence. It looked like a global event. The photographs tell the story better than any archive. Doorways sitting 2 floors below the new street windows, peeking out from under packed layers of soil. Entire facades cut in half by raised groundwork crews digging downward. Not upward scaffolding built only to reach new, artificially elevated streets. And remember, these were not abandoned ruins. People were living in these cities while this was happening. Daily life continuing above a buried world. As I cross-checked more cities, I noticed something even stranger. The architecture beneath the mud often looks older, more refined, and more precise than the architecture built above it. Massive stone arches, perfect symmetry, foundations deeper and cleaner than anything expected from mid-1800s craftsmen. Why would entire cities bury floors that were structurally sound? Why raise streets instead of removing the sediment? Why do the earliest photographs ever taken appear right when cities were digging themselves out? The deeper I went, the clearer something became. The official story does not match the physical evidence. Engineering logs from the 1850s mention unexpectedly deep foundations, unmapped subterranean rooms, walls thicker than construction records indicate, ancient stone layers beneath planned excavation zones, and in the margins of several documents, a word appears quietly, not dramatically, not in conspiracy theory style, just small, subtle references. Tartarian. Old foundations, Tartarian origin, structure older than recorded. Not enough to make a claim, but enough to raise a question. Were these cities uncovering something they didn't build? Because when you zoom out across continents, a pattern emerges. The buried floors match each other. The window ratios match each other. The stone symmetry matches each other. The depth of the mud layer matches each other. Even when the cities themselves had no shared architects, no shared governments, no shared technology. Which leads to the central idea of this new, expanded investigation. The idea my previous video only touched on. What if the 1840s weren't just a period of modernization, but a period of excavation? Not building upward, but digging downward. Not creating new streets, but uncovering old ones. Not inventing cities, but recovering them. What if the mid-1800s were the aftermath of a global event that buried an older architectural world? And what we call street raising was actually Operation Unearthing, the coordinated recovery of whatever the mud had buried. Before we open the engineering maps, before we compare the identical excavation practices across continents, before we examine the architectural signatures that point to something older than the 19th century. If you want more investigations like this, make sure you're subscribed. It helps this research continue and tells me to release the full series. Thank you. Now, as I kept digging into the records of 1840 to 1880, one question refused to go away. What exactly were they unearthing? And why was the world so quick to cover it back up? When I expanded the research beyond a handful of cities, something became immediately obvious. This wasn't an isolated problem, and it wasn't a collection of local urban reforms. It was a pattern so consistent, so mathematically precise, that the official explanations started to collapse the moment the data was placed side by side. Because once you line up the records from Paris, Chicago, Warsaw, Vienna, Boston, San Francisco, Istanbul, Melbourne, and St. Petersburg, you begin to see the same sequence repeated almost point for point. 1. A sudden appearance of compacted earth measuring between 2 and 4 meters in depth. 2. Lower floors instantly becoming unusable. 3. Streets raised upward rather than sediment removed downward. 4. Excavation teams documenting older architecture beneath the new city. 5. And then a strange silence in the historical record. What struck me immediately was how synchronized these transformations were. These cities had different governments, different climates, different geological conditions, and different levels of industrial development. Yet every one of them entered a massive street-raising phase within the exact same 30-40 year window. That isn't natural development, that is coordination, or reaction. But reaction to what? As I sifted through engineering logs and municipal notes, a key detail kept reappearing, almost in passing. Almost as if the writers were trying not to draw attention to it. Unexpectedly deep foundations discovered, substructure older than documented plans, arches and windows found below recorded floor level, rooms identified beneath original ground layer. None of these comments were expanded on. They were treated as nuisances, obstacles to construction, footnotes in the margins. But when you collect all the footnotes from around the world, they tell a completely different story, because these deep foundations weren't crude, they weren't unstable, they weren't proto-industrial. They were advanced. Stonework cut with precision that outperformed the tools of the 1840s. Arches too large to be functional basements. Columns whose geometry matched buildings supposedly constructed centuries later. Window frames buried so deeply that their original purpose became impossible to explain through the conventional timeline. And the strangest detail of all, none of these structures were built to be underground. Every architectural feature showed signs of normal, above-ground use. Weathering patterns, soot marks, and wear lines at what used to be ground level. Which leads to only one reasonable conclusion. They weren't designed as basements. They became basements, buried by something that cities did not publicly acknowledge, yet all responded to. When I compared the photographic evidence, the consistency became even more jarring. In every city, work crews were digging down, not building up. They weren't constructing new floors, they were uncovering old ones. Yet the official paperwork labeled all of this as modernization, sanitary improvement, regrading, street elevation. It didn't matter which city, the phrasing was nearly identical, as if copied from the same template. That was my first major red flag. Because independent cities don't write the same excuses, unless they are all trying to avoid referencing the same event. And the deeper I looked, the more one name quietly surfaced in the margins of engineering journals, archaeological notes, and municipal archives. Tartaria, never in bold letters, never discussed directly, always implied in phrases like older than records suggest, previous architectural period, unknown builders, inherited foundations. It became clear that what modern cities were raising their streets over was not industrial infrastructure. It was old world infrastructure, structures built with a different standard, a different technology, a different world view. In this next episode, we'll look at the one event, the one decade, where this older architecture disappears from public view forever, and why the world suddenly stopped talking about what they found beneath the mud. Because once I reached the records from the late 1870s and early 1880s, something changed dramatically in the archive. Not slowly, not gradually, but almost instantly. The detailed excavation notes stop. The engineering logs become vague. City councils suddenly stop discussing buried floors, old foundations, or sediment removal. It's as if the entire world went silent about the subject at the exact same time. And the timing isn't random. When you overlay the excavation timelines from Paris, Warsaw, Chicago, St. Petersburg, Boston, Lisbon, Turin, Melbourne, all the cities that reported buried architecture, you begin to notice the same abrupt pattern. By the early 1880s, the documentation simply ends. Not because the work was finished, but because the subject disappears. Even more unsettling is what happens immediately afterward. Cities begin issuing new building codes. Architectural styles shift overnight. Urban plans are rewritten. Older structures are refaced, modified, bricked over, and reclassified. It's as if the world decided, simultaneously, to hide whatever they had just uncovered. The architectural disappearance. When I compared photographs before and after the 1880s, the contrast was shocking. The ornate Tartarian-style windows that used to appear at what was once ground level, covered. The oversized arches that belonged to a completely different era of engineering, sealed. The symmetrical lower floors exposed during the mud excavations, declared basements, even when they had front doors. Even entire facades were redesigned to hide the fact that these buildings were originally much taller, much older, and built to a standard difficult to explain with 1800s tools. And this wasn't isolated behavior. City after city followed the same steps. Re-stucco, the old masonry, replace original stone with brick coverings, seal old windows, add new entrances higher up, rewrite building dates in registries. The result was a total transformation of the buried architecture, not by rebuilding it, but by controlling how people saw it. It wasn't destruction, it was curation. A global reframing of the old world into something that looked more modern, more Victorian, more consistent with the timeline we're taught today. The silence in the records. Here's the strangest part. City governments were incredibly detailed in their documentation before the 1870s. Every sewer, every tunnel, every foundation repair, every street alteration, recorded carefully. But after the buried structures were exposed, a near-total blackout, no debates, no disagreements, no public reports, no architectural controversies, just an eerie administrative emptiness, as though whatever these cities uncovered in the mud wasn't meant to become part of the public story. And then comes the final piece. A sudden rewrite of history between 1880 and 1890. Nearly every major encyclopedia, national registry, and architectural index was updated. Construction dates for older buildings were standardized, even when earlier documents listed different years. Entire styles were reclassified. Terms like Old World, Pre-Imperial, and Ancient Civic Design disappear from literature. Tartarian architecture, the style consistently found beneath the mud layer, is overwritten by new labels: High Victorian, Neoclassical, Roman Revival, City Beautiful Movement. But none of those styles explain the deeper foundations. None explain the 12 to 18-foot buried floors. None explain the precision stonework. It was a perfect historical sleight of hand. They didn't erase the buildings. They erased the story of the buildings. Why did the world stop talking about what they found? The answer isn't written directly in any archive, but the pattern speaks loudly. Cities uncovered something older than their own history, something advanced, something uniform across continents, something that didn't fit the official timeline. And instead of integrating that discovery into the historical record, they buried it again, this time with paperwork, not mud. The silence wasn't accidental. The timing wasn't coincidence. The uniformity wasn't random. It was the moment the world quietly stepped away from the old civilization beneath its feet and embraced a new historical narrative. A narrative built not on the evidence found underground, but on the decision to never mention that evidence again.